The global report card shows inflation pressure.
Or whether we're talking about inflation.
All right, let's go to the inflation figures out today.
Inflation has eased substantially from a peak of 7%.
Erdogan hopes his move will bring down inflation.
Inflation has come down.
Inflation figures will be released today.
But that's what happened. This is inflation. This is tic-tac. This is tic-tac. This is inflation. This is what's happened. I just happened to have somebody...
That word you hear in the news every other day, and probably don't understand that it affects you more than you realize. That is why your morning coffee is getting more and more expensive every year, for the price of which 10 years ago you could buy a full meal at a cafe near your home. But why does it happen, and how to slow down this increase in prices? Today, you will get answers to these and other questions about inflation, and also learn why a small level of price growth is even necessary and beneficial for the economy. Inflation is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services in an economy rises over a given period of time. This means that the cost of everyday essentials like food, clothing, rent, and transportation go up, making it harder to maintain the same living standard unless wages rise accordingly. In other words, each unit of currency can buy fewer goods and services. Let's say $10 that you have in your pocket buy you 10 kilograms of potatoes or whatever you want to buy for the lunch today. If the annual increase of inflation is 10%, the next year your $10 might buy you only 9 kilograms of potatoes. So the next time your slacker friend asks you,
"Hi bro, can you lend me $500 please? I will pay you back in a week."
But in reality, he will pay it back in a couple of months. Think about whether to charge him interest. I'm kidding, just don't lend money to such people. Inflation impacts everyone, whether you are a lucky owner of the multi-millions business or someone working a minimum wage job. Rising prices make people to struggle to afford the lifestyle they used to. Inflation affects not only individuals, but also behavior of businesses and governments. Inflation isn't a modern problem. Even in ancient civilizations, there were forms of inflation, though they weren't always recognized or understood the way we see them today. Ancient Rome, for example, faced inflation as early as the 3rd century Anno Domini. As the Roman Empire expanded, they needed more money to fund their military campaigns, so emperors began to reduce the silver content in their coins. Back then, you might have been able to buy a loaf of bread for a silver coin, but as the silver content dropped, it started taking 2 or 3 coins to get that same loaf. Essentially, they were printing more money without adding more value, just like governments do today with paper currency. In more recent history, inflation has fluctuated significantly. For example, after World War II, many countries faced high inflation due to war spending and reconstruction efforts. By 1948, for example, wholesale prices were 200% higher in Austria, 1,820% higher in France, and a massive 10,100% higher in Japan than they had been before the war. In the 1970s, the world experienced stagflation, high inflation combined with high unemployment, triggered by the 1970s oil crisis, which was marked by 2 major oil shocks. The first in 1973 followed the Arab oil embargo in response to U.S. support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Arab members of OPEC cut oil production, leading to shortages and soaring prices. The second shock came in 1979, triggered by the Iranian Revolution, which disrupted global oil supplies. These events of rapidly rising prices led economists to rethink inflation controls, laying the groundwork for modern monetary policy. All right, since we already have an idea of what an inflation is, let's figure out why it actually occurs. Inflation is not a mystical creature that wakes up in the morning in a bad mood and decides, let's make everything more expensive so that people suffer. No, this is a consequence of different factors that divide inflation into different types. For example, one of them is called the demand pull inflation, which is characterized by the fact that demand side for goods and services in an economy is higher than supply side. In turn, companies take advantage of the fact that their products are in demand and decide to charge more because people are willing to pay. It may occur due to different reasons, such as money printing, increasing government spendings, decreasing tax rates, and some other. After World War II, the U.S. saw a surge in consumer demand as soldiers returned home and started families. Everyone wanted houses, cars, and household goods, but the economy wasn't producing enough to meet the demand. Imagine an auction where many participants bid for the same product, and each of them increases the price of the product in the desire to get it. As a result, inflation in the US reached 19.7% in 1947 compared to the target 2 to 3%. Next, we've got cost-push inflation, which occurs when firms face higher cost of producing goods and services increases. This could be caused by rising wages, increased prices for raw materials, or even supply chain disruptions. In such situations, businesses typically pass these additional costs on to consumers. Another type of inflation happens when workers expect prices to rise, so they demand higher wages. Raising wages mean that businesses have higher input costs, so they have to increase their prices in order to maintain profits at the same level, and the cycle keeps spinning. It's an endless loop. Finally, inflation may occur due to our behavior that we change depending on our expectations. For example, if you expect higher prices in the future caused by some political or economic events, you will adjust your behavior and rush to buy goods and services before they become more expensive. This ends up creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Knowing what inflation is and why it may occur, we can move on to the next topic of how economists measure an actual price increase. This means not just noticing that every grocery shopping trip is becoming more expensive. Special tools have been created for this purpose, and for a more accurate calculations, inflation is considered from the perspective of consumers and producers separately. The most widely used measure of inflation is the Consumer Price Index, CPI. The CPI measures the average change over time in the prices paid by consumers for a basket of goods and services. This basket includes everything from food and housing to medical care and transportation. The CPI is a good indicator of how much it costs the average person to live. So if this imaginary basket costed you $100 previous year, and you hear on the news that the inflation is up by 5%, this means that now it costs you $105. While the CPI measures prices from the consumer's perspective, the Producer Price Index, PPI, looks at things from the seller's side. The PPI measures changes in the selling prices received by domestic producers for their output. This includes everything from raw materials to the finished goods sold to retailers. Let's say you own a bakery. If the price of flour, sugar, and other ingredients goes up, you'll likely increase the price of your cakes. The PPI tracks these increases, showing how much more producers are charging for their products. Basically, the PPI is like the behind-the-scenes version of inflation. It's what happens before prices hit us, the consumers. So, this is clearly visible on the graph that if the PPI is rising, you can bet CPI will follow. Additionally, economists use the GDP deflator, which measures the price level of all goods and services included in gross domestic product. While the CPI focuses on consumer goods and services only, the GDP deflator gives a broader picture by including all economic activity, not just what households purchase. Measuring inflation is a tricky task, and the result may be subjective as it depends on what is in the basket. We have talked a lot about inflation, but what about its less famous cousin, deflation? If inflation is the rise in prices, deflation is the exact opposite, meaning that prices go down. Sounds awesome, right? But hold on, there is a dark side of deflation too. Deflation happens when the overall price level of goods and services decreases over time. At first glance, this might seem like good news. Who wouldn't want cheaper prices? But deflation is actually dangerous for the economy because when prices fall, consumers and businesses delay spending, hoping prices will drop even further. This leads to a reduction in overall demand, which can slow economic growth and even lead to recession. To understand how this can happen, imagine that you are waiting. The new smartphone model is coming soon. However, you don't buy it in the same day of release. You will probably wait some time because you know that in a couple of months prices will go down. If the same mindset were to spread throughout the economy, no one would spend money, causing the economy to slow down. One of the biggest dangers of deflation is something called a deflationary spiral. As prices fall, companies make less revenue, which forces them to cut costs, often by laying off workers. With fewer people employed, there's even less spending, which causes prices to fall even further, creating a vicious cycle of economic decline. A classic case of deflation leading to economic disaster is Japan in the 1990s. After a major asset bubble burst, Japan experienced deflation that lasted for years. Prices kept falling, and consumers kept waiting for things to get even cheaper, resulting in what's known as Japan's lost decade. Now, if you thought inflation and deflation were bad, buckle up, because there's something even worse. The economic nightmare where inflation and unemployment are high at the same time. and economic growth is stagnant is called stagflation. Normally, you would expect inflation to come with a booming economy, but stagflation flips that expectation on its head. In this situation, there are not enough job offers, people are making less money, but prices are rising. The most famous example of stagflation, which we already talked about in this video, occurred in the 1970s, when oil prices soared due to geopolitical tensions. The price of oil quadrupled almost overnight, causing production costs to soar across multiple industries. This supply shock hit economies worldwide, triggering rising prices alongside stagnant economic output, as firms faced higher costs and struggled to maintain production levels. The resulting mix of inflation and unemployment created a challenging economic crisis. The reason stagflation is so difficult to deal with is that the traditional tools for fighting inflation and unemployment don't work well together. Raising interest rates can slow inflation, but it also slows down economic growth, which makes unemployment worse. On the flip side, lowering interest rates can stimulate the economy and reduce unemployment, but it risks making inflation even worse. Since we are on the topic of fighting inflation, let's delve deeper into this issue and discuss the various methods used by central banks and governments. Regardless, inflation can be a real headache for the economic agents, such as households, businesses, government, and central bank. The good news is some tools have been created to fight it. One of the most effective ways to control inflation is through monetary policy, which is controlled by central banks like the Federal Reserve in the US. The central bank's primary tool is the interest rate. By raising interest rates, central banks can make borrowing more expensive, which reduces consumer and business spending. This causes demand to fall, after which prices stabilize or even decrease. In the early 1980s, the US was battling high inflation, which had surged to over 13%. In response, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker took aggressive action by raising interest rates to unprecedented levels, with the federal funds rate reaching nearly 20%. This sharp increase in rates curbed inflation by making borrowing more expensive, slowing down consumer spending and business investment. Though it triggered a short-term recession, the strategy worked. By 1983, inflation had dropped to around 3%, stabilizing the economy and restoring confidence in the dollar. Apart from central banks, governments also have some methods to control inflation using fiscal policy. It helps combat inflation by adjusting government spending and taxation to influence overall demand in the economy. When inflation is high, governments can use contractionary fiscal policy to reduce demand and slow price increases. This is typically done by reducing government spending or increasing taxes. By spending less on public projects or services, the government reduces the amount of money circulating in the economy. Similarly, government can implement expansionary policy, raising spendings and reducing taxes, to stimulate the economy during periods of slow growth or recession. So, you're probably wondering what level of inflation is best for the economy. Most likely, many will answer that it is 0%, since in this case, there will be no increase in prices, which means that all economic agents will be happy with this. However, the central bank has its own target level of inflation, which maintains balanced economic growth, price stability, and employment. For most developed economies, this target is set at around 2% per year. But why 2%? It's seen as a level that supports steady economic growth while avoiding the harmful effects of both high inflation and deflation. A low, predictable level of inflation allows consumers and businesses to plan for the future, encourages investment, and ensures that wages and prices can adjust smoothly over time. Essentially, the 2% target acts like a cushion, giving the economy room to grow without the risk of runaway inflation. If people expect prices to rise slightly over time, they're more likely to spend money now rather than hoard it. Plus, moderate inflation helps businesses adjust wages without cutting salaries during tough economic times, which could harm morale and productivity. To maintain a stable inflation rate, central banks use three primary tools: interest rate adjustments, open market operations, and reserve requirements. As we already know, by raising or lowering interest rates, they influence borrowing and spending, cooling or stimulating the economy. Through open market operations, central banks buy or sell government securities to control the money supply. Buying adds money to the economy, while selling pulls it out. Finally, by adjusting reserve requirements, they determine how much banks must hold in reserve, impacting how much they can lend. Together, these tools regulate money flow, keeping inflation within a stable, targeted range. Inflation is a complex but essential part of the economy, impacting everything from the price of everyday products to the global financial landscape. It may seem like a constant nuisance, but understanding its causes and consequences can help us better plan and adjust consumer behavior. We've explored its causes, its measurement, and its complex relatives, like deflation and stagflation. We've also seen how central banks and governments work tirelessly to keep it in check, using tools of monetary and fiscal policies. While inflation can feel like a burden, a small, steady level is actually essential for a thriving economy, encouraging spending, investment, and innovation. So, next time you notice rising prices or hear debates about monetary policy, you'll have the knowledge to understand what's at stake. The economy is a delicate balancing act, and inflation is a part of the dance. Remember, being informed is the first step toward navigating its challenges and taking control of your financial future. Thank you for watching this video. Stay curious and subscribe to the channel to learn more about economics and finance.